All right, open worlds is what we're going to talk about. Richard started with the question of, or basically the challenge of trying to define an open world. And
Mm-hmm.
what I came to, I'm gonna lay out my thoughts and then give each of you a chance, and then we'll touch back with Richard. I at first I thought, actually I still think it's really just a matter of perception, because the main takeaway that I get from people calling something an open world is really how much you're given to do, how early on. Like that's really the main thing that I get. And then I think of games like the Just Cause games, Far Cry, the Elder Scrolls games. And but really the more I think about it, that kind of setup, that because that also works for the even the original Fallouts, but those are 2D games. So really but nobody called that open world. In fact, even the game's own manual doesn't refer to it as one. So I really think open world is just how you look at it, and it's really, I think, a sense of scale. That's really what defines open world more than anything, because there are a ton of games that let you do a lot of things right from the get-go, that let you explore a lot of the overworlds, which is what I always thought of them at a pretty early point in the game. So that's what I thought about open worlds. For me, for a long time, it was really more just like marketing buzzwords.
Okay. I can Fernando can say something, or I can read what the Twitter people have responded with.
I don't get to go.
Oh, go ahead, Bleach. You're so quiet. You were so quiet last time.
I mean, last time.
It was
You mean yesterday?
Yeah.
Oh, because I had my mic muted and I didn't know. I just came up with an open world game is a game with no or few gates and a single large, seamless level that has at least one goal.
I feel like that's going to be brought up a lot, but I'm not sure how necessary it actually is for the world to be seamless in order to be considered an open world.
Mm-hmm.
It goes back to really my main point being perceptions. Like you can nitpick all those little details of, you know, how many gates there are, or whether or not it's seamless, or whether you playing in a virtual space, or even whether it's 2D or 3D. Like, oh no, if it's 2D, it doesn't count. I know some people who are like that, where like Retro City Rampage doesn't count as an open world to them.
Then does a game like Mega Man count as an open world game? Because you can go in any order from picking the bosses.
Yeah.
And it's
See, see. This is why I say it's a little bit about turn. But the easy answer is no, just because of the fact that it's still a level select. Or I mean, sorry.
I thought you were gonna say the easy answer is no because it has 2 letters in it. It's one syllable answer.
Right. Anyways, what I was gonna say is the reason for the Mega Man one is because, you know,
Yeah, levels.
well, I had a lot of complex thoughts about it, and I didn't. That was kind of just like to try to be as definitive as possible without being too broad or too vague. Like usually, an open world, it it can't. It has to have a goal because otherwise, it's just a sandbox. Sometimes they have a critical path, or sometimes they don't, which is usually the only part of the game that's actually has any linear level design.
right.
They usually have side quest tropes that are duplicated over the environment to give players things to go to and do. And
Yeah.
sometimes the map may be gated off until you reach a certain point in the critical um, path of the missions.
Hmm.
Um, but not always. Like in GTA, you can go to other sections that you're not supposed to, but you're wanted level good, and it's really difficult to survive. In some games, I think I think Far Cry. I haven't played it, but you just go to a tower and then it like the Ubisoft open world games, it would just show you what the map of that section or something, but you can still go anywhere.
Hmm. Yeah, to a
Breath of the Wild does that, but I don't know if that's unique to Breath of the
don't-
Wild.
the reason why the Mega Man one doesn't quite work is because there's no concept of a world. It's just 8 distinct levels, and while it is non-linear that you can pick them whatever you want, there's no sense of them being interconnected. And that's to me just the one distinction between interconnected and seamless. I just want to make that distinction right there because you can totally have something like, well, even the first Zelda, when you really think about it, each of those screens are cut off from another, and each one has to load into the other. So it's just a bunch of interconnected pieces. It's not seamless, but it's still a
I
world.
wouldn't really. The original Zelda, I would consider the world to be seamless. The screen transition is just a technical limitation. I
Right.
think there's if you look at like the newer Zeldas, they kind of it it is for loading, obviously, but they kind of intentionally chunk the areas of the map and give them themes and stuff,
Right.
and has an intentional loading transition and an actual title of
Mhm.
the area and stuff like that.
Right.
So you would consider
But I
you
think
consider
maybe
that open world?
I actually don't think it. See, if it did the sort of Monster Hunter thing where you go into another area and it loads it, or even like in Twilight Princess where you move into a different region and there's a very clear like loading transition, I still don't think that actually matters.
What were you gonna say, Fernando?
yeah, I was thinking about my definition for open world and what you guys were just saying, and I think that maybe open world, obviously I think in some ways it started out as a marketing term, but it's also descriptive in some ways. And I think maybe open world is very closely related to simulation, trying to simulate a world, a living world. Obviously, no game simulation is perfect. So I think in a way that open world, maybe the technical things do matter. So, even the original Zelda with the screen transition, surely, yeah, that was because of the limitations of the day. But it seems fair under a definition where you're trying to simulate a world where that's a poor simulation. So maybe that's why things like seamless transition is so important when or given so much importance when talking about open worlds, because you're trying to give the impression of a living world that then is open and you can explore. And that also helps to differentiate it from games like, more traditional games like Mario, where, yeah, maybe you can go from level to level. Even if you were able to do it seamlessly, it wouldn't maybe be defined as open world because it felt less like a simulation of a imaginary world. Does that make sense?
Yes, I would just like to briefly add that Zelda 1 isn't an open world game because it has a lot of keys and locks. Um, you have to get certain items in order to get to certain dungeons. So
I
it's not
think
like you can go to any.
right. But going back to simulation, like I think an open world could work with keys and locks as long as those keys and locks are presented as part of the simulation of the world. Because the real world has keys and locks. You can't go everywhere right away. There's gonna be security guards.
Second
But-
world.
But I don't think that's open world. I mean, one of the
Right, I don't think
cadets that
Zelda
you have
1
to-
is by open world. I think is the keys and
Well, I mean,
locks.
even the keys and locks. I mean, I want to discuss Breath of the Wild, but Adrian hasn't played it, so I'm going to try to avoid it at all costs.
Just talk
One
about
of the-
Zelda 1. It's
One of the
same.
cavets of an open world game is that the designer never knows where the player is or what they have, so there's no way for them to have really any layered level design. And one of the foundations of that, at least I think, Richard can correct me if I'm wrong, one of the foundations of layered level design is having keys and locks to give certain challenges for the player to overcome in certain orders. Is that
Keys and
right
locks
or wrong?
Keys and locks aren't that important to creating layered level design, you can pretty much do it a whole bunch of different ways. Keys and locks would make things more obvious, or
Right.
like if you go through a level at Small Mario versus Super Mario versus Fire Mario, they have very specific sort of ways to tackle the enemies and secrets you can access. Well, that's kind of what you're talking about with power up keys and power up locks, but it's not the only way.
So
Or
What about a
vehicles
link between
in open
worlds?
worlds. No, I was just making a little comment about things that layer the design, or that vehicles, in a lot of open world games work similar to those power ups in Mario games, about changing the way you move through a particular space and changing the challenges that you can get access to or that you experience.
Mm-hmm.
They just work better with the fantasy of open world, of feeling like you're in the world.
Did we want to bring up a link between worlds, which is
I have
kind
not.
of a half hybrid of traditional Zelda and open world?
I have
We'll
not
bring that up
played it.
later. Okay.
So my last point is about openness because it's part of the term, and the whole idea is actually this is related to what Bleach was talking about with locks and keys, and this is why I earlier say it was a matter of perception. It's that if people notice the locks and keys, they'll say it's not open world. But sometimes open worlds, even the ones that people do call open worlds anyways, like your Far Cry games, your Just Cause games, they still have some forms of locks and keys. So this is why I say it's a matter of perception, and why I think it actually goes back to the point of scale, to where big enough that there are enough challenges to where there's enough non-linearity that it feels open, even if there are things that are locked anyways. And typically at an early point, maybe that doesn't even matter, where it's like, oh, the open world comes 20 hours into the game, like supposedly what happens with Final Fantasy 13. But
Yeah.
the whole idea is having a lot to do, a lot of places to go, and relatively few locks or few perceived locks.
How important is it the world feels like a breathing, living world? Even though, like when you play Grand Theft Auto, you see the pedestrians walking down the street, you have traffic simulated. Might not have the largest, some of that might not have a big impact on gameplay. But is that an important part of open worlds? These little added elements of making it feel like it's the real world?
I don't really think so, because you have quite a few open worlds that are in the realm of fantasy. So obviously, and then you
Well,
also
it could be like wildlife instead of pedestrians. It doesn't have to be a realistic thing.
Right.
It could be fantasy wildlife.
Okay. Sometimes
It
I
doesn't
think
really have an effect on the game, though.
yeah,
It usually doesn't, and not a major one, anyways.
yeah. I was gonna say I think it feels easy to conflate open world with sandbox, where you have a lot of things. Sandbox is like having a shitload of things that you can interact with, which is typically what the GTA games are renowned for. But you can have open world and still not necessarily have that, because to me, it's like open world. The key thing is right there in those two words, open world. You have something that needs to be a world, which means not Mega Man levels. Something.
The,
But what's the difference between a world and just a really big level? I mean, it could be called open level game.
Yeah, no. You
the
could totally
technical
have that.
definition of open world is not Mega Man levels.
No. See, if you had something like a bunch of Mega Man levels like strung together in a sort of weird Metro. Actually, I think one of the Mega Man games does do that. Like I
Mega
think
Man ZX Advent.
yeah, that one.
Garbage.
But if you have I'm gonna play it. I'll
That
make
game's
that judgment for
garbage.
this thing.
Keep
Okay,
going.
whatever.
Can't
If you had
defend
something
games you
like
haven't
that,
played.
if you had something like that, where they're interconnected, whatever, and you can go to whichever one you want, then yeah, that would be more of a sense of an open world. Of course, it goes to the point of, do people even consider 2D games to have, or 2D side scrolls have open world? You could have a
So
2D open world Metroid game where
we'll get there.
Why do people think open world games should be 3D and 2D? It seems like that kind of hints at the whole simulation of a world.
I was
Well,
thinking,
Because our people have a harder time seeing a 2D world sometimes as a real world, because our world is 2D, it's 3D, right?
He's
And I think there's our world is 3D. But obviously, like all this, because it's open world game. Because yeah, it's true that pedestrians walking around, little birds chirping, or fish moving around like fish is not key to a game, but open world seems a little bit like a hybrid, and it's a lot of it is, well, all games have hybrids, stuff that's not necessarily 100% essential for games. You can have a game without music, but that's an important part of tons of games. And I think when people hear open world, they feel like, yeah, I want to visit this world, and it wants to feel somewhat real and somewhat alive, even if some of that aliveness stuff, being able to see it in 3D, being able to see random, birds fly through the sky, fish in the water that you might not interact with gameplay wise. Is that not an important part of what people think of when they hear the term open world? That's why I think maybe open level
I don't
would be a
think it
different
is.
thing.
Yeah, I
I
don't think.
think what you're trying to say, sorry, Adrian, but I think what Fernando's trying to say is he believes that being a simulation is important to an open world game, but there's many linear games that also have many simulation elements that people kind of expect as production values go on. Things like pedestrians and birds chirping and lots of ambience. I'm not sure that's necessarily
Or like in the new
connected.
Zelda game, the monsters seeming to have their own lives. I haven't actually played it, but that seemed to be like one of the things people like pointed out.
All right, so we're gonna stop asking questions. The purpose of this conversation is not to raise questions. You guys need to start making some definitive answers to things. So I'm gonna go through our Twitter responses, and you guys need to have a firm stance on whatever I say. No more questions.
Okay.
All right, so
Roger.
one of the first responses is open world is nothing is an open world. Open world is a myth. All worlds are closed. All worlds are the same.
That sounds like a joke response.
That was Chris Wager. So it was a joke. Here's the next one. Gameplay with non-linear questing. What do you think?
I don't think so. See, the main thing there was non-linear questing, which I don't think that actually matters to what people normally refer to as open world, because I'm pretty sure that games like The Witcher 3, Just Cause 2 definitely has this. The Far Cry games, the Fallout games have things that you do in a main quest that you typically do in a set order, which already breaks the definition of non-linear questing.
So
Unless
wait,
they mean
is it
non-linear.
a side quest by definition, a non-linear optional quest?
Yeah, I was getting to that. Unless they mean to say that at any time apart from your main objective, you can go off to do a side objective, in which I would say yes. So
That's what a side quest is.
yeah,
And
that's-
Is it a side quest when the only thing the
Yeah.
game has is side quest?
no,
It's technically main quest then.
yeah.
or
So
no
what-
quest.
What I was getting at is if the main quest itself did not have an order to it.
Then is it even a main quest?
It could be kind of like get all these crystal orbs, and then when you have all five, you win the game with some big story thing. So the main quest may not have an order, but it may have requirements.
That's
Yeah.
true.
That's what I'm thinking of.
So, but what happens if here's what you haven't distinguished between: is the gameplay within the quest relatively linear, or are we talking strictly on how you acquire quests and can you do them within other quests? All right.
That's a good question.
Because the word open is in contrast what most people are assuming is linear or guided. So, but it's always degrees to that, right?
Yeah.
So small level, you're doing small sequences of things probably in a specific order. Your gameplay loops can get pretty tight and small, but on a grand level, you may have a lot more freedom. You may have various levels of linearity on the quest level or in the order that you pick quests, but each quest could be quite non-linear. So it gets pretty complicated.
Right. I always perceived open world to be more on a broader level, basically non-linearity on
The topmost.
the topmost level is like when I can do quests, but nothing necessarily says that the quests themselves, like say you're playing a game, like nothing says that themselves have to be like you're playing Deus Ex, where it's like, oh, it's this base and you can go in however you want. No, it can be something completely linear, like in some of the shootouts in Sleeping Dogs. It could be something just like that.
Well, I mean, open world games even often have games within games, right? So they
Yeah. I mean, most big games have games within games because they're so big. And most
right.
open worlds
Well,
have
I mean, sometimes they even have like an actual like arcade machine go up to and play an
Mhm.
old
Mini-
2D game, you know?
mini games. Yeah, mini games
And
have
that,
been in just about every adventure game since adventure games were a thing.
Right.
So whether it looks like an arcade or it's like, hey, do this archery challenge, or
right.
that was by a guy named Jose Gondinez, which is here's the next one by a guy I met playing Barbary Ball at tournaments in Chicago, but his name's Double A. He says, an open world has big towers and climbing them unlocks millions of inscrutable icons. Yay or
Okay.
nay?
That sounds like another joke one.
Well, yes.
It's a common trope that happens in actual open world games.
Can you list me an open world game
A
that
bad one,
doesn't
probably,
have
but
that?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure
Right.
Ubisoft does that a lot because they do the Assassin's Creed games, the Far Cry games now. I think they also do those, and I think even Watch Dogs probably also does that. I don't even need to
It's
play Watch Dogs, but it probably does something along those
it's
lines.
company policy.
Yeah.
All right, so Dan Cook says, I like that nonlinear questing over a large geographical area.
That
Are we getting closer
that's more reasonable, I think.
than the jokes? I hope so.
Yeah, I'm not
Yeah.
so sure. You know, how do you define large geographical area?
We'll
How
get
big
to-
does it need to?
We'll
You
get
know?
there. So here's another guy's response. It's in 4 parts, I think. So he says, off the top of my head, 2 criteria. The overworld and quote-unquote levels are identical in mechanics, or a bright line cannot be drawn between them. If, for example, dungeons in Skyrim or Final Fantasy 15, Metrovania stuff like in Dark Souls 1, he says. Criteria 2, the game is designed to encourage nonlinear progression where the player is supposed to determine their own path through the world, generally not always, rather than following a predetermined path. And then the last step is to cement it, the exploration being a core engagement. That is an open world game.
That seems pretty a lot better than the previous definitions. It's longer, so maybe
Yeah.
I missed parts of it, but it makes sense to me. The exploration definitely makes sense. At least when you hear open world, it's like it's a world to explore, and that's a
Mhm.
big part of the draw.
The game
Yeah.
is designed.
Probably when people laugh at those like towers, you go at the top and then boom, everything's revealed.
Not everything.
Not everything, but you know, if too much of it's revealed, then you feel like you're not the one exploring it, even though you have a lot of choice and you can pick the order in which you do it.
Hmm.
Right.
I mean, you lose some of the sense that you are the explorer.
I wonder what Columbus felt like then.
Yeah,
Oh no, there's people here. Oh man, I'm not an explorer. But that's enough about Columbus.
So
right. But he had to go and talk to them and find out what to explore. It wasn't like a handy map with like color-coded icons and a legend.
Wow, say that to Sacagawea.
hey, Richard, could you
Sakazuchiya.
Sacagawea? Never mind. History.
With the guy, some guide that he had.
She was a guide to
Okay.
Lewis and Clark in their exploration of the early Americas. I don't know. I'm not
Right,
a history
no.
person. Okay, moving on.
So, to go through the world, generally not always, rather than follow a predetermined one. Well, this partly goes again to why I said it's a matter of perception, because a lot of times it's like, oh, I feel like I'm doing my own thing, but even then it's like most quest objectives are usually predetermined, and if there are ones that are unlocked by you fulfilling quests before them, well, that means there is some form of things being predetermined. But the whole idea of do you have main quests and side quests and you can do them whatever you order want, it still actually meets this criteria.
That's what all those quest markers are for.
Yeah.
To give you little carrots and just kind of orientate you, I guess.
Yeah.
All right, we got to get through these.
Okay.
This guy says to me, a quest is doing the task and earning something for it. So in Banjo-Kazooie, you have just one quest, save 2D. So he says, if someone asked me to describe Banjo-Kazooie, I wouldn't say it's an open world platform. Say it. No, I think an open world can work for just about any genre, he says, but it takes some clever gameplay mechanics. Because I threw in questions to all these people whenever they said stuff. I'm like, but do you think Banjo-Kazooie is open world?
That's like the perfect example of what I mean by saying it's a matter of perception, because technically Banjo-Kazooie, at least from the little that I played over at a friend's house, you can get those jiggies in pretty much any order you want, which means here you are in a 3D sort of sandboxy space where you can go whatever and get these things in whatever order you want. Like, that fulfills a lot of what it is of open world, but because you know it's just one of 15 different levels in the game, you don't see it as an open world anymore. So maybe if you took that same level and magnified it by 10 times or 12 times, then all of a sudden it feels like an open world, because it's like, whoa, look, it's this huge giant space of stuff to do. That's why I feel like it's a matter of perception, and why a certain element of scale is there, because non-linearity is a component, but if there's only so many things that you can do, there's only 4 quests you can do them whatever you want, it's non-linear, but it still feels like a small number, then it just doesn't have that sense of open world. So yeah.
Go ahead.
I would definitely disagree with the second part about how any game could be made into a good open world game. That just seems quite a stretch.
We haven't defined it yet, so you might have to hold on to that.
Oh, it depends. Yeah, maybe based on my current preconception, but Tetris open world, I don't know. I don't see it.
Sounds pretty awesome to me, though. So this guy named Ben H, he says, I think in the broadest sense, a game whose gameplay and events take place in a large, interconnected, freely navigable area. I'm not sure non-linearity factors in as much as most would say. Games like Mafia 2 and LA Noire are open world but have very linear progressions. But I think most would also say that those games use their open worlds poorly, but he disagrees. So maybe it is important to consider. But he says, yeah, absolutely. It also has some facets others have pointed out, like focus on exploration and nonlinear progression. So yeah, I asked him, would you say that Grow Home is an open world? You guys know Grow Home?
No.
I know the game. Yeah.
This is Ubisoft. You're like a little dude, and you just kind of crawl on plants, and you try to grow the plants all the way up into the sky because you fell out of a spaceship. Just kind of a little experiment, and they turned into a little game from a small group of them over at Ubisoft in their spare time, so that was pretty cool. But let's see. He says he's heard a lot of folks call Metro or Mass Effect Andromeda open world, but he's not sure he agrees. Large play spaces, yes, but open world, unsure. I think too often we conflate open world with more content, and that's no good. Often means that there's more padding and busy work, he says. So he's questioning the linearity being that important for the consideration as well.
And you can have.
Well, in Grow Home, you can't go directly to the top, so it's not. You can't. I wouldn't consider it open world, even though you can go directly to it. You have to spend a lot of time growing the plant. But I guess, in a sense, you spend a lot of time going to the outer edges of an open world game too, so maybe it could be.
So what I'm thinking right now is, let's taking about him questioning whether linearity matters. So it's like, okay, let's take an existing open game that's considered open world, strip out all the side quests, make it so that there's just one main quest, and you do each part of of those main quests in an order. You still have the freedom to go anywhere you want in the world, but you won't necessarily have a quest, so to speak, to do when you get there, because you haven't unlocked it in the main quest yet. Would that still be considered an open world? I think some people would probably say yes, because I can go wherever I want, but and it may not be part of the main game, but this is what I wanted. This is what I consider open world.
Hmm.
So that large, free to move, interconnected space, not necessarily seamless. I don't think the seamless matters as much. Maybe some people it can make or break, but large, interconnected, free to move. The progression, however, may not matter as much. But I think that part, open world, is a big part of it.
Hmm.
In fact, I was playing a text adventure game where you could do exactly that. You could go anywhere you want, but if you don't follow in with the beats of the story, you're not going anywhere. It's called The Lurking Horror. It's not a very good game.
We have one of our next definition. He says, "Are you asking for the definition of an open world or a good open world game? Feel like a lot of folks are going way too broad. Open world is correlated with certain quest design standards and map unlock mechanics, but it isn't defined by them. 1. Open world is a digital space with no, or as few as possible, non-diegetic walls. The space should be explorable in at least 2 axes, so he says no one-dimensional open worlds. He says 3. There are some wishy-washy definitions of scale and freedom to explore within that digital space. Yeah, so I give 3 points for that.
Could you not have a one-dimensional, like have you guys read like Flatland, the book Flatland, where they explore like a 2D geometric world?
I heard about that book when I was in middle school, I think.
It's a really good short book. It's like a fantasy, mental
Mm-hmm.
experiment of what would a 2D world be like with a cute kind of story built around it. But it seems to me it would be more difficult to do a 1D open world game. But if you sold the feeling of it being a world, then you could explore it by jumping, further to the left or further to the right. Seems like it could still technically be an open world game. Might be really difficult to do and hard to sell the feeling of it being a world that you have freedom to explore. But I don't see how that is 100% necessary part of the definition.
Mm-hmm.
That it can't be 1D. Did he say? I forget. Did he say anything about 2D? Did it have to be 3D, or just couldn't be
2 axes?
At least 2D, or at least 2 axes. Yeah, no. I disagree there.
Interesting. I wonder if you.
Well, it depends on what you mean by 2 axes. I guess 1D world can have time. That's an axis, right?
Well, 2 spatial axes, we'll say, because he said the space should be explorable in at least 2 axes.
Yeah, if it has to be spatial dimensions, I would disagree.
So okay, so that was an interesting answer. Somebody gave me an image of the planet Earth with a cross section of its core and molten core and lava, and he said this is an open world.
Well,
James Lance says a game whose levels are spacious, largely outdoors, and whose connections between levels themselves are physical game space. He says Banjo-Kazooie is open world and Mario 64 is not, because you teleport inside of you just jump in paintings basically. He says ultimately I think a walkable glorified level select is sufficient to call a game an open world, but in most of those areas have play. I have a hard time imagining a game like that would ever be thought of as an open world. So when I responded, I said, what about games where you can't walk or move through a virtual space? Can you make an open world game where you're like not an avatar moving around? And then he's like, I have a hard time imagining that. I'm like, why? It's all kinds of games where you're like a floating camera or not, right? Can you have an open world that has no camera?
Right.
It's interesting. Dan Cook says you start to get into omniscient view strategy games. Open world is almost always embodied by avatar moving through space. And I was like, yeah, so far, but we're talking about, is it possible?
If you're just going by the words open world game, thinking, right. I mean, because it's like there's the history of that word. I don't know who used it first. Was it marketing? Was it a game designer? And then it's how it's perceived by the players. But technically, I think, you could have a single screen world, open world that you explore without changing the camera angle, and you have freedom, and you can explore in whatever order you want. It seems like it could meet all the criteria we talked about earlier.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, those are all the Twitter responses. So now, before I throw the questions and the discussion back to you guys, I'm gonna get your simple vote. You say yay, nay, or bleh
Uh-oh.
for these games if you think they're open world or not. You guys ready? Or you need to type yay, nay after I type in the game so we can keep track of all this data. It's tricky, or is it?
Well, I'm not even sure what the definition of no open world game is. I just feel doubt. It's like it's hard to vote when you don't feel so certain about what it is.
It's true. Yeah, we had all that whole conversation. You guys are much more comfortable just throwing questions around and then having a long conversation. But yet, at the core of it, there's no definition yet, so it becomes difficult to actually apply it with simple yes or no answers.
Right?
Yep.
All right, so it's interesting. I think GTA 3, the 3D one, was like one of the first open world games. You know, scale is large. You had 3D world. Definitely had a lot of simulation aspects to it. We don't really call simulation games open world like SimCity, right? But then you're like, why not?
Yeah.
It's just like you have a large world, and it seems pretty open. But then, so like even the idea of having a sandbox seemed pretty important. It got brought up a couple of times when people were talking about open world games because I think people naturally assume a level of freedom when they say sandbox. So that kind of aligns with the openness concept. You have a sandbox, you certainly have the freedom to mess around in that capacity. Therefore, if you have that inside of a large world, you're like, well, at least it's open for that. Things with SimCity, you got your sandbox, you got your large world. It's top-down 2D. Yeah, but people think of it a lot differently than they do if they're an Avatar. I mean, certainly things feel most like a world if it's from some kind of like limited Avatar perspective, because that's kind of like how we live in real life, and the real world seems big to us because we're just a little ant running around on the surface. But I don't really think any of that matters. Certainly for scale, you look at previous things in the genre, right? The Witness is interesting because previous puzzle games, almost all of them don't have worlds at all. Then we have games like Portal, the Talos Principle, stuff like that, right? They popped up. Even Professor Layton. Professor Layton has a world. You can explore large towns, talk to a lot of people, RPG style, get quests, and by quests I mean just do puzzles on the spot. And discover secrets. It has secrets everywhere and things like that. So Professor Layton, for all intents and purposes, is a adventure game. You got a lot of adventure tropes in it, including mini games and menu, fitting things together in menus and uncovering the full story. So it's totally an adventure game, but the worlds aren't that big. Certainly bigger than like Tetris, and it's non-world, but not terribly big compared to other adventure games. So identifying the genre that something is sort of being a part of is important for setting our expectations. We look at games like The Witness and we're like, well, not only is that island pretty big, the island's pretty big. Compared to other puzzle games that have worlds like Portal and stuff, you're like, okay, well, it's pretty big compared to those games. In The Witness, everything is seamless. You're like, okay, well, that's cool. That's at least, even if being seamless is not that important, it's something to note, something that we can easily sort of figure out, like, oh, it's seamless, cool. The areas in The Witness are non-linear to get to, but once you get to them, you have to do the puzzles in the order. So there's a progression within areas, but you can leave at any time, but then you could leave at any time in many puzzle games. Some puzzle games just give you access to all 100, 200 levels from the get-go, and you can just solve them in any order. They're open in that sense, and for the in terms of sequencing in order, but there's a lot more to being open than just doing things in different orders. And I think what not a lot of people have said in this in the responses is what were the suspension elements and dynamic elements at play, because those are the things that make at least to me the world seem most like a world. So video games with their ability to create levels. They just teleport stuff in, and then you go into a small specific area, you beat it, you get zapped out, and everything is deleted, right? So the thing that's more intuitive and natural to a world is things just don't get deleted. If you can take something from one area to another and it's there because it's suspension, and then when things happen in some areas, they potentially have an effect on where you are because everything's connected. So more so than scale, to me, it's this ability of these dynamic and suspended elements, whatever they are, and however important they are to the core interactions or the core gameplay. The Witness, you run around, and if you consider the core gameplay to be the panels, how you solve a lot of those puzzles involve thinking outside the box, meditating on the structures and the architecture and doing things like that. So it very much uses its world outside of the actual panels, and then it even does kind of stuff beyond. So the world isn't just there for nothing. Oftentimes they're integrated to the actual puzzles, and sometimes they're just there for like to convey ideas that are supposed to lead you into the right line of thinking to then solve the puzzles. Like everything is there for like some kind of relatively close to gameplay related purpose. So that's cool. I think another thing that people commonly associate with worlds besides scope and scale is the lack of meaningful content, believe it or not. So like if you want to go to a store, all the cool stuff is inside the store. But the walk up to that store, the sidewalk, the road leading to that store, not necessarily cool at all. Because you know that in real life, events and places and things are concentrated in actual locations. And they leading up to those locations are not necessarily interesting, but for one reason or another, we can associate those highs and lows and how they're distributed across space as being somewhat of a realistic distribution. So a lot of times in open worlds, what gives it the feeling of the world is the fact of having no sort of game designer trying to make it fun for you, not necessarily fun, like not adding extra challenges, not adding an NPC to give you story content, not adding any of that. It's just kind of there, right? In open space. That's why traversal seems to pop up a lot in definitions of open world. The explorable space, the space in between meaningful level things needs to be explorable because in a lot of ways people want to see the nothing and experience the nothing between the somethings. And the more suspension and dynamics your game has, that nothing can be filled with your something. There's just not anything there from the start. So in GTA, while the roads may be just roads, like a simulation almost of just a city, once you get the cops on you, those roads become your escape route, and everything you know about those roads and all those nooks and crannies and tuck-away points that had pretty much no quest or level design associated with it becomes relevant because it's what you did because you robbed a bank and everyone's after you, right? So it's not that the world's filled with nothing, but starting off on some sort of like a low level of content or interaction or interesting things also means that there's potential for you to fill that. So that's kind of neat. So whether you're talking about Breath of the Wild or any other sort of open world game, those are important considerations. Like, not that how big it is, and not how sort of empty it is, or how easily you can sort of navigate through it initially. It's what can become of that space. What's just like the Witness? What is that space communicating about the meaningful content that's just next to it, and what is the experience like moving through that space between meaningful content, and how that space in between can be more interesting if you keep doing stuff. Like, those are all more important considerations, and those are the things that I look for when I'm considering openness. A lot of games are traditionally built with specific linear levels in mind, or specific set pieces, or specific progression, and those ways of designing those kinds of experiences work directly against this idea of, well, I just took this rock from this other area and now I threw a rock at your boss. Like, that's not how people design things typically. So in general, when you're designing an open world to try to create these levels of suspension, you have to think more systemically than set piece like, right? You have to just think, well, we just made sure that rocks were available in the world and that they don't break the game when you move them. And if you were thinking more set piece, you'd be like, oh, this helicopter crashes down right here, and we know that this area is going to be platformable because there's no rocks. Well, that's a completely sort of opposite way of designing elements most of the time. So that's why a lot of people seem to talk about linear elements and sort of traditional level design as being as being sort of an antithesis to open worlds. So whether it's a quest, whether it's whatever, the nonlinearity in general, you have to apply more of these systemic game design, game engine practices in order to make that, to get the whole openness of the world to happen at all. In terms of gating and stuff, every open world has gates, right? Like I said with the Witness, Minecraft, you need to either survive or you need specific like digging equipment or whatever. Like you can't just go anywhere without either doing stuff or preparing. Like that's, you can't go, even though you may be able to get near the areas initially and no one's going to stop you and say, hey, you don't have your sword, kid, get back in the town. Essentially, being open to moving around the sort of in between empty space of an open world is what people consider to be open enough. Whether or not they're strong enough, to handle the monsters there, or why is it puzzles there, whatever. Like a lot of times, openness just means you get to taste for something you're not ready for. I mean, honestly, there's a non-linear aspect to like, oh, you can just see something and go for it. But that aspect of exploration can happen in very linear or design-oriented games, because the only thing you're able to see is what they provide for you. So if you see something curious, go for it, check it out. It might be a secret. That applies to Mario Brothers platformers and just about any other genre. So that aspect of play is, it's not very distinctive or unique to open world games. So if you think about all these things, if you walk through the process, if you compare the games and you think about it, I like some of the really stark definitions of open world because, but the trick is when we say open world game, we're saying open world game, right? So there's got to be a game there, and depending on what the game is, you have certain kinds of expectations and affordances based on its most common tropes and other things. So that's why I was asking, like, what's the difference between an open world puzzle game and an open world adventure game? Adventure games typically have a lot more verbs, a lot more NPCs, a lot more set pieces and actions and things to do. So a lot of people have a lot of expectations when you say that. But if you say open world puzzle games, like with The Witness, everyone's expectations are probably much more minimal, much more reserved. You're like, oh, I'm expecting some panels, I guess, and maybe some more. Like, so it's all about sort of breaking that expectations and doing more than what the convention typically does, because like I said before, if what the genre conventions typically do, if those things are mostly, the history of those things is mostly the product of set piece and like carefully crafted level design, and just taking that one step beyond and trying to create those kinds of experiences in a somewhat systemic way is pretty much all you need to deliver that kind of freshness and that kind of design elements that qualify it for being an open world. And it's all about, like Adrian was saying, it's all about perception, but it's really all about sort of expectations and the history of what's come before. So when you say open world, you're saying it's a more open world than what you've had before. And when you say open world, you're like, well, it has to be a world in the first place. So, games like Tetris don't really count, but you can certainly have an open world puzzle game if you do different things. So that's the open part, whether or not it's dynamic suspension, whether non-linearity plays a factor, and then whether or not the genre that it's the base genre has certain sort of levels of expectations and limitations that they then break. The world part, to me, it can be 1D, 2D, 3D. That doesn't really matter. Game space, so you explore the game space. I think you can even have an open world game that doesn't even have interactable virtual space. So let's say you have something like SimCity. SimCity has all those little simulation details happening inside of their simulation. So let's say you don't have any power to change the buildings or add a building or anything. You're just observing. Now, even though it's extremely rare, there are video games that have no dynamic space. They're often word puzzles or things of that nature, like sound puzzles, in order to get you to answer with a yes or no question. I guess like Rhythm Heaven also has no dynamic game space, and it's a music rhythm game. You can say Guitar Hero doesn't have any dynamic game space either. The note track is just a visualization, but there's nothing you can do to move the notes or anything like that. So it's really just you can memorize it and still play the game. Nothing's going to happen different on the note track. So it's possible to have very visual representations of things without actually being able to interact with it, and therefore you should be able to create an open world game where you have no avatar, no spatial exploration, and yet, like we said before, the internal dynamics, the suspended elements, not of the things you do, but of things that you observe within the simulation, could be important to your questioning. Maybe based on the ways you answer your questions, different things change in the world, but you're not changing anything directly. Like maybe that's a thing. Like who knows? But once you start thinking along the lines of these core elements and expectations, SimCity quiz game expectations, you start to get a really good idea of how little it takes to make a game open world, and then how it can be adapted to other genres and situations, and how our current understanding of it, even though it may have started as a marketing term, and what we understand of it now may be an amalgam of so many games that may or may not fit the criteria, regardless of how you define it, these underlying parts can be examined independently and thought about independently, which is much more important in the long run, I think. So yeah, and my best answer is looking at games in the past that genre is aping up after, checking out how dynamic and suspended elements are working, checking out non-linearity. I mean, a lot of people love non-linearity, but it's pretty overhyped. I was thinking about I was designing like a music rhythm game that was open, like, and I really thought like you could really take advantage of sort of like it was in a city, so you would be on roads walking down the street with all this crazy musical stuff happening around you. And I'm like, there's no reason that you need to be an avatar walking down the street. You could literally be in like a car that's rolling down the street, but what you look at or how you play your little musical instrument or controller could determine how the world interacts around you. And you could go down any street at any time, or you can just kind of be on the track. That still doesn't mean that the things on the sides of the street aren't a product of the open world, aren't dynamic in an open world sense, like things actually affecting each other. Like, okay, so for a simple example, like let's say you are playing this game and you play a bad note and somebody freaks out and like burns their restaurant down. Well, if that happens, then let's say somewhere else in this open world, the fire truck has to come, and you can hear the fire truck from far away, and it has a certain musical beat, and then it eventually gets to that restaurant, and then the people putting out that fire will no longer be in other parts of the city. So like, it's pretty easy to see how the things you do, even on a linear track, can have dynamic open world suspended effects that have consequences that ripple forward in a very organic and easily observable way, because everything's sort of in a cohesive game space. Like that can happen too, and it can all be based on your player actions, which even in a situation where you don't control your avatar. So yeah, like you do have freedom, but your freedom may not be to explore the space with an avatar. You can explore the space with music. You can explore the space with non-spatial, or you can explore the possibilities with non-spatial mechanics and interactions. You can even explore concepts like abstract things. It's interesting if you try to create a metaphor for an abstract space, like an abstract concept, and you're trying to explore that concept. Like, what could you do with that? You could say music itself is abstract. It has no strong spatial connection. So you could explore like a musical space. Like, what would it mean to define a whole world in musical terms, and you to explore it? um, all you would need is some kind of consistent way to move through the world musically. It could just be like, if you know anything about music, the circle fits and the way that chords move into each other has like mathematical relationships and there's some order and structure to the way it works. So you can imagine, you can make an abstract, visual, less open world in which you explore musically with your ability to play notes at the right time, in the right ways, in the right place, whatever. Like, why not? It's not crazy. Like, it's just when you really start thinking about, when you really stop copying games in order to figure out what's up and just understand how all these things work or can work, then all the possibilities start to open up and you have complete control over it. But yeah, let me know what you guys think because I just said a lot of stuff.
Yeah, that was a lot to take in. The bit what you said about the world, or a key component of the world being a layer of suspension, I think that's important. Now that I'm thinking, well, this does go back to freely exploring, but I also would say that being able to go back to areas you have been is kind of integral to the whole open world thing. Because imagine a version of Spelunky where you could actually go back through levels you've completed. Because that's a game where roguelikes in general have a lot of suspension, but there's no open world roguelike. But you could totally do an open world roguelike if you had a lot of areas you could go to start and you could go back to them at
Yeah, you can just imagine Minecraft. Like if Minecraft actually had a game inside, just take your favorite roguelike RPG elements and stick it into Minecraft with the grid-based system. Yeah, that'd be exactly what you're saying. Like, can you go back to your starting area? What does that mean?
Right. And that bit of the world being changed, or
I heard Fernando. What did you say, Adrian?
No, hold on, Bleach is actually just wrote something in the chat.
Okay.
You make it sound like open world is a sandbox with some goals that can be done in any order.
Any order. A sandbox. A sandbox is more like, I always felt like a sandbox is a play space, an interactive space in which they give you lots of tools to do whatever you want. So that even to the extent of spawning in things or changing parameters, and even though you can turn those things into actual gameplay mechanics, typically those things are like, level editor, Gary's mod kinds of things. So that's what I think when I hear sandbox.
I'm a little bit the same way. To me, like I mentioned earlier about not conflating open world with the sandbox, because, again, in a way you can think of the Deus Ex games as, sort of sandboxy. They give you a lot of things to do. You have this base, approach it from any angle. Even Metal Gear Solid, it can be like that at times. But I wouldn't say either of those are open worlds. I don't think anyone considered them open worlds. Even the new ones, I don't think they consider that an open world.
Yeah, I mean, having a bunch of options does not make it a sandbox either. I mean, in a fighting game, you have a character that has like 30 plus moves you can do at almost any time. That doesn't mean it's a sandbox. It just means you have a lot of moves. It doesn't matter how many sort of dynamic effects there are, because games are always filled with these. Most games are filled with a bunch of dynamic effects. I mean, that's why we have such cause and effect relationships between so many different elements, because they're linked by these rules that connect them.
I see. Then I mistaken the definition of a sandbox. I thought a sandbox was just like to give you a bunch of mechanics and you can just play around with them and there's no goal.
Yeah,
and if you add some goals in, it seems like that kind of defines an open world is. But I guess you're saying that the sandbox is things like Gary's mod where you have control over everything.
Like you're saying, sandboxes don't have goals, and then usually they give you a lot of control over stuff because you're supposed to find your own fun. But as soon as you stick a goal into it, usually in order to make it a decent game, you have to limit their controls. So like, if the goal were to get to a place, you can't just have them like fly to it or teleport to it because they have sandbox controls. So usually you want to limit that. As soon as you start limiting things, you start making it more and more game-like. So that's why, in general, sandbox experiences are the antithesis to gaming experiences.
So then we talked a long time ago, and you said that Minecraft, the create mode, was just a sandbox. But if you can't, if you just throw it in there, you can't do anything but what the rules are given to you, then is it still a sandbox?
I mean, all systems, all experiences, and all games, all pieces of software are bound by their rules. So that's everywhere in life you're gonna find that. So the free create thing in Minecraft is a sandbox. The little survivor mode is more like a game. I think they have the goal of like reaching the dragon or like doing something. I don't really know what it is, but even a little goal is a goal.
So there's one thing I'm curious about. It's So you made a point earlier about, Grand Theft Auto, about those empty spaces, roads. Seemingly, they just are just things you do to get from point A to B. But once you, mess with the cops, that's when all of a sudden the roads, the world, takes on a new meaning. And it was also the idea of the world, those empty spaces pointing to more meaningful content. Now,
They contrast the meaningful content with their
Right.
nothingness.
right. So what I'm curious about now is why did you write the original Zelda, Ane?
Is it may lack a permit?
No. When he was asking us about open worlds, and he put in the original Legend of Zelda, Richards put Nay on that one.
Yeah, the original Legend of Zelda is like pretty much like all the other ones. Like I was saying before, going anywhere it's not that really important to me. And how much it sort of looks like a world, it's not that important. So in reality, Zelda's one's overworld functions just like the overworlds in just about every other Zelda game. Each one of them are handcrafted to provide all these experiences and secrets and battle challenges, and then they place certain buildings and other sort of things in the world. So according to sort of adventure game style setups, that's more or less what you expect from an adventure game. You don't really have adventure games that do much modeling of non-worlds. And then if you kind of try to model a world and you try to put people in places, then you can't have the people in the same places the enemies are, so you start to space them out. And then you just can't have everything next to each other, so you put stuff in between the space, and then you have something that looks pretty much like Zelda or most other adventure games. A crafted, pretty focused experience. Even though the Zelda one, you can get lost, and it's kind of like pretty raw and crazy in that aspect. For the most part, the underlying design direction and principles were laid out in the first Zelda, and they really sort of refined it by A Link to the Past. So I don't consider that to be an open world game. There's not a lot of suspension outside of your avatar, just getting more powerful, Link. So that's pretty typical for RPGs, adventure games, video games, and so it's more in line with what we see in so many other genres than the kinds of things we see in GTA and so many other pretty undisputed open world games.
Okay. So here's a simple question: if they did not program, like let's say Grand Theft Auto, wasn't a crime game, you had the exact same world, but not a criminal. Or actually, basically, say something like L.A. Noire, where there's no concept, or I'm assuming there's no concept of a police chase because you are the police in that game. Does that make it not an open world anymore? Because now those spaces don't have that element of suspension.
I mean, I'm not sure. I don't really know much about LA Noire. based on that guy's tweet where he thought it was open world, but other people said they used their open world poorly. That could be a make or break kind of situation depending on how they implement stuff. So it could just be a glorified menu, which is what you don't want, right? I think it's pretty clear that we just don't want basically the meaningful content all in these sectioned off areas, and then the paths in between them are pretty nothing, right?
Right.
They have to add up to the overall experience, and the more it does that, and the more ways it can do that, at least, the better. To the more richness and the better, the more cohesive experience your overworld is overall. So I think No Man's Sky has tons of emptiness. I'm not really sure how it turned out in the end, but being able to generate that many planets and having all the planets have their stuff generated, and space being so big, I don't know how much you warp in between the planets, but like a lot of that is virtual space that you can explore, and a lot of it doesn't have a lot of meaning. But to appreciate the vastness, appreciate the sort of range of varied content that their algorithms can spit out, to collect a few things when you can, to build a few space stations or go to a few nodes on an entire planet and just like uncover some data, like that's, you can tell most of that is kind of like empty, but at any point you have the potential to like set your space station down on it to colonize a particular area, to somewhat defend against the local invading robots or whatever. So like even in that emptiness there's potential in No Man's Sky. But if you contrast that to something that's just like a glorified menu, then that's really not what we're talking about in the open world. And then if you contrast that to what the original Zelda does, and like, the original Zelda is something interesting on every page. So there's really no sort of empty space. There's no wilderness to it. It's just a lot of it may have that feeling, I guess, compared to some of the other things that they were doing, but that was so long ago. To me, it's just more Zelda.
Okay. I was about to ask. All right. So what about Ocarina of Time and the 3D Zeldas? They generally have more spacious areas. Hyrule Field being a big example of it's a field. Not, I mean, there are secrets, around, but more in that big center area. There's actually not a whole lot going on. Even in Termina, you're still just gonna have spaces where you can be running for like a minute. You won't fight enemy. You won't fall in the hole and find a secret. It's just space for you to run through. So, what do you say to that?
Yeah, it seems more or less what all adventure games, well, except for the point and click ones, but like, all your video game adventure games do. Like, the content's not going to be right next to each other, but you may take a few seconds, minutes, whatever, traveling between nodes. And even if there are secrets or things that happen in those areas later on, sometimes it's just like this field is just a field, so you get across it. Like, that's it.
I'm
I
sorry.
wouldn't consider any of that significant enough to be or large enough to be a world compared to other games in this genre, and I also don't think it's open enough.
Okay. Yeah, I was thinking that, but I also forgot that point earlier where you said you don't want everything to be exactly next to each other, because that's not even how the 2D Zelda games are made.
Yeah, that's what most games do. Like, as soon as you put something in some kind of a world, they try to space things out a little better. That's why 2D top-down games can get away with it, which is why, old school RPGs, they can kind of put things on like screen to screen right next to each other, kind of put NPCs in a cluster, make their towns really small, because we can only see a part of it at a time. You have to assemble the town in your head. Like, you have to assemble what it is by piecing together the pieces, and that's a lot more work. So you can get a feeling of the town being larger than it is because of that. And that's why 2D games can kind of get away with things. That's why 2D Mario doesn't have to have their worlds and levels so big, because you're moving through so much of it. Once it's out of sight, it's out of mind, so it makes it feel like you've done so much. But then the 3D games have to design the content differently because you can see so much more of it at a time. So in a 2D Mario, you can run to a Goomba, then a Koopa, and then jump right on the next like a few inches. You're like fighting some other junk. 3D, you're like, hey, one Goomba at a time. Or like, hey, there's an enemy in this like area, right? Not only in the 3D ones is there more space, but just they can't really do that density in the same way. So 3D, you naturally get a lot more empty space, and that's why I think it's so much easier for people to both understand open world games as being 3D and also to see the sort of empty vastness in terms of that third dimension.
Yeah. That
So Bleach says we have a large seamless world with many elements of simulation and suspension and non-linear objectives.
yeah, Bleach wrote a bit here.
When I
He
play
doesn't
open world
want to
games,
use
I
his
always
sword.
get the perception that they are designed more on the end of sandbox than the game. Most of the appeal to me seems like make your own fun and screwing around and not doing the quest. They mostly allow you to interact with the world by driving, shooting. I've always felt like that's cynical. Well, that's the GTA fan base to a T. A lot of them don't complete the game. A lot of times the gameplay is not good. So, of course, goofing around with the other stuff and flying around is less violent and more interesting. So, too bad. I mean, that's GTA style.
Breath of the Wild is probably the best open world game I've played, and I'm still not keen on the structure of how they are. But there's a lot more systems at play in Breath of the Wild than any other open world game I've played.
Yeah.
They're usually just the interaction with vehicles and weapons.
Yep. Just like Breath of the Wild coming from an adventure game style game instead of a shooter means it's a lot more comfortable doing a lot more kinds of verbs that you've seen in other Zelda games. Compared to Horizon, I'm not sure how much else you do in Horizon besides like a little collecting and some shooting. And other games like GTA focus on vehicles and shooting. There's not too many open world games in general, but yeah, like, and when I say empty space, it's like relative empty space, right? The distance between things, to make things seem more sort of like non-designed and more sort of raw and unexplored and untouched, undesigned. So that's kind of the feeling you get.
More like a world.
Yeah, even though worlds often have designed a lot of sort of common elements, whether nature carves things out or people who used to live there carve things out or whatever, like paths through a forest and all these different things. So yeah, it's relative emptiness, like compared to like a dungeon or a town. The wild areas of Breath of the Wild are pretty wild. All they're out there is like animals. Animals are weather.
Well, there's a lot of a certain something that we both know what it is, but we won't say because of Adrian. And I like and dislike it. I mean, you can tell that every part of the world was lovingly designed and handcrafted, and there's this discreteness on how they placed that element that we won't talk about. So you can always get a sense of where they are, and you get this kind of spatial sense of the positive and negative space of where things are and where you're just traveling.
I mean, Breath of the Wild, just getting to a place is a challenge, both in terms of how you're going to get there and like what you're going to encounter as you travel, and then orienting, right? How you're going to keep track of everything. And the less time you spend in your map, the more you need to look into the world to understand it. Even though they give you things like little meters and little heads-up displays that give you information, I think you can get all the information you need, or almost all of it, just from looking into the game world. So while typically in other games you kind of ignore the details and you kind of ignore the fact that the people look all uncanny and they're not actually realistic and all that, and maybe you ignore certain other details, in Breath of the Wild, you increasingly pay more and more attention to it because that's what I mean by like dynamic elements. The richness of your world comes from the dynamic elements you create, not necessarily how realistic it is, because all these games are abstractions and they're all an artifice anyway. So when people say living, breathing, what they really need to say is that these are the details that I like instead of this is realistic / whatever. Because it's not realistic to me. Like those are the details I like. So when I see GTA and stuff, I'm like, hey, sure you made it look kind of good, I guess, in certain screenshots, but there's other details that I think make it look less interesting and less realistic to me.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I've tried to play open world games. I tried to play Skyrim. I tried to play Infamous. I tried to play Grand Theft Auto. They just all, and even Red Dead Redemption, they just all put me to sleep.
Oh my god.
It's terribly boring.
Infamous is
Just
how freaking let down that game is.
A lot of Western games have a hard time making their movement interesting to me, and like their mechanics very solid. So like, it's already hard enough to get things going.
Yeah.
So when they kind of like layer on, when they build their open world off of a genre I don't really like Western RPGs or like violent shooting GTA games with just really bad shooting movie mechanics, you're like, well, I don't have that to look forward to. So then there's really not much else for me.
Yeah, I think the last open world game I actually played was the the original 3D Grand Theft Auto. So,
Well,
and I mainly just played with it as a toy. I never finished it. I don't even know what the goal was. And never finished the story. Drive around the car listening to the radio stations,
yeah.
poke at things.
So I guess to wrap up before Bleach leaves, open world is not a genre in itself. It's a modifier you can put on another genre. And right when you put it on, then because it's a modifier, it's easier to understand it in terms of what other genre it's being attached to. It's just like with normal gameplay, a lot of the same considerations also apply to open worlds. Density of content, variety of contents, dynamic elements, suspended elements, layered design, like all these things, except for, when you create a world, you can give things a little bit more slack because the highs and lows of gameplay versus non-gameplay elements, or like the climactic gameplay parts, is contrasted with these sort of empty spaces in between those parts. So instead of going out into the menu, instead of going into like a routine of where you like get your mission, go accept the mission, then get teleported to a zone, all that is much more organic. You can just run from place to place, and oftentimes it doesn't even take more time than it does in other games that aren't open world. It's just that wrapping that all up into the presentation of a more or less seamless world is a really neat way to it's a really sort of alternative, somewhat equivalent, but neat way to deliver the same kind of game experience. Because you can make an open world where, people are talking about Breath of the Wild between places, and, I'd like to sit down and time myself, but, I did a lot of empty exploration in all the Zeldas, Wind Waker, Link Between Worlds, and Phantom Hourglass, the Spirit Tracks, and I explored the corners of stuff. Even if I was on a 3D train and I could only control Link's train on the tracks that they gave me, I still explored it. Like, there's still plenty to do. And I really feel like Nintendo designs all their Zeldas with like a relatively equivalent level of in between travel time, potential secrets to explore, towns, and the cadence of towns and dungeons or whatever. So just because Breath of the Wild looks huge, because it is huge, and there's a lot of like empty nature, I don't think it actually breaks that cadence. It just delivers the same kind of Zelda overall effect in a different way, but people freak out because they love. People have extreme adverse reactions to things like non-linearity, and for better or for worse, if you're the kind of person who really likes non-linearity, then things being open world and things done right should appeal to you greatly. So it's not trivial to say like, oh well, since I like linear things and non-linear things, the non-linearity in Breath of the Wild isn't that big of a deal. Well, it kind of is a big deal, but it's more of a big deal to other people. So I see it in front of them.